Data Science Talks. KI und Data Science. Einfach erklärt.
It's an effort to look at elections from a more data-driven perspective where we use data science, statistics, and statistical methods. Data scientists have a real responsibility to get this stuff right because it impacts how people act.
Welcome to Data Science Talks. I'm Johannes Lederer, professor and chair of data-driven mathematics at the University of Hamburg. My team and I work on data science, statistics, and artificial intelligence. In each episode of this podcast, a guest and I discuss a current topic in AI and data science. Today's episode is in English rather than German because it's our special on the US presidential election with a very special guest from the US, Lakshya Jain. Lakshya is a machine learning engineer by day and an election analyst by night. His insights on US elections have appeared in the New York Times and elsewhere. Lakshya, I'm really excited to have you on the show.
Really happy to be here.
So Lakshya, in the show, we have the tradition to start with a round of 3 quick questions that you may answer only with yes or no. Ready for that?
Yes, let's go.
All right. Would you prefer a popular vote over the current system of electing the US president?
Yes.
Can machine learning and data science help to gain insights into elections and predict their outcomes?
Yes.
All right. Then let's try one prediction. Will Donald Trump be back in office next year? Difficult one?
Yes. Okay, now let me caveat that. This is being said in late July. Kamala Harris just started her campaign. When Donald Trump was running against Joe Biden, he had a 75 to 80% chance of winning the election by the time Biden had dropped out. Harris is just starting a campaign, and it is really difficult to start a campaign when you start from behind. And right now, she is still behind. Now, my gut says Trump will not be back in office, but I never trust my gut. At this moment, the data says that he is a 2-to-1 favorite to be back in office.
Cool. Okay, so we'll talk much more about that in the coming about 30 minutes. But let's start first with your daytime job, right? So what are you doing as a machine learning engineer?
So I'm actually an AI engineer in a company that works on solar products. So my day-to-day job actually involves a variety of both software and AI applications for better improving the solar industry and just trying to make it smoother to install or approve solar projects.
Great. And then besides that, right, you analyze and predict elections together with your team. Can you tell us
Yes.
a little bit about that?
Yeah, so in my spare time, I do elections analysis and polling and modeling for Split Ticket, which is a site that me and several of my friends created together. It's an effort to look at elections from a more data-driven perspective where we use data science, statistics and statistical methods and modeling and mathematical techniques in order to predict and analyze and explain American elections.
The website you guys are running is called split-ticket.org. We're gonna drop that link in the show notes, right? And so I announce it as your night time kind of hobby, but actually it's a lot of time you spent on that, right?
Yeah, I spend probably about 20 hours a week on it. So it's definitely almost like a half job, but we really enjoy the work that we're doing. We feel that we are still able to add a meaningful amount of value to the conversation, which is why we do it. And it's been really cool to see how it's grown over the last couple of years.
When did you start that?
You know, we started this in late 2021. Um, we felt like in late 21, we kind of thought that this was a space where there just weren't that many people doing a lot of things. There's obviously, you know, the folks from the New York Times, the folks from 538, as the two main focus points of elections analysis. But beyond that, there really wasn't that much data-driven analysis of elections. A lot of it was just people talking to other people and reporting what they think. The problem with that is this has been a very, very bad way to predict anything, really. You know, it's not just elections, just in anything, predicting based on what others think is going to happen has been a very, very bad way to analyze or understand anything.
So your kind of mission is to bring a data science view on that prediction and analysis business, in a sense.
Yeah.
Currently, of course, you and your team are covering the US presidential elections. Our German listeners are aware of that election, but they might not necessarily know all the details of it. Let's start with the likely candidates. There's Donald Trump, nominee of the Republican Party and former president, and there's Kamala Harris, almost nominee of the Democratic Party. And so how did these two candidates get selected?
Yeah. So with Donald Trump, he won the Republican nomination in 2016, and then he became the president after he won that election in 2016. So once he became president, he spent 4 years in office, and then he was voted out of office in 2020 by Joe Biden, who defeated him. So there's two parties in the United States, right? The Republicans and the Democrats. Trump was a Republican guy. Joe Biden was a Democratic guy. Biden was Obama's vice president before, and Obama was also a Democrat. So when it comes down to it, you know, Trump, despite losing in 2020, he still maintained an iron grip on his party. They followed every single thing that he said. He said that the election was stolen, which it was not, but he falsely said the election was stolen. They went along with it. He would endorse certain candidates who parroted his views and said that we needed to bring Trump back to office, and the party's voters would vote for him. So Trump was in this unique position of being extremely powerful despite losing an election. Half the reason is because his voters didn't think that he really lost. So for 4 years, Trump has been basically waging a campaign against the Democrats, you know, and he's obviously won the Republican nomination again. And in the meantime, Biden is 82 years old. So there were a lot of questions that Democrats already had about his age and his mental acuity. So at some point, what ended up happening was basically that Biden had a really bad debate, a really, really, really bad debate. And Harris was the vice president, and the party was uncomfortably behind Biden for a while. They said, okay, you know, he's old, but he's the president. He is our person. We can't just kick out the president. Then the debate happened, and Biden looked like an 82-year-old. And the problem with being an 82-year-old is that you don't look fully coherent or cogent. So the party decided, they panicked, and they said, Biden's out. Let's get Biden out. Let's bring Harris in, because we cannot take the risk of Donald Trump potentially returning to office. And we don't think that a candidate who's not fully mentally coherent, in our opinion, will possibly be able to wage a campaign. This is how we got Kamala Harris as the presidential nominee for the Democrats. That's how she's going against Donald Trump. I hope that was a good breakdown.
That's an excellent breakdown. And actually that's also go into like those, you know, the system of like how they get the nomination, like this political election, right? There's a process, right, called the primary election. So there's kind of like an election before the election, right? So both, actually not Kamala Harris, but at least Donald Trump had to go through that process as well, right?
Yeah, exactly. The thing is that the rules for the nomination are a little bit weird. So normally you have to run elections in order to win the nomination, but winning the elections to get the nominations, right? Like in each state, you say, I am the party's preferred nominee. The problem is, if a candidate chooses to drop out, they can actually just say, okay, I won all of these votes, but I don't actually want them. I don't want to run. I'm going to tell all of the people who are going to vote for me, who are representing me, to vote for this person instead. And I'll recommend that they do it. Now, they don't have to follow that recommendation, but usually they do. And this is kind of what's happened here. Biden endorsed Harris as his replacement. So Harris won the Democratic nomination without actually running any elections.
Okay. Maybe let's put a timestamp on all of this. So it's July 30th, 2024. With a pool of candidates, potential candidates, right, with Harris and Trump clearly being the most likely winners of the election. So how is now out of this pool of candidates, how is the president going to be elected in about 3 months from now?
So what happens is that in the United States, very similar to a lot of other countries, the national popular vote doesn't actually mean anything. Some of your followers may have followed the British elections, in which Labour won 410 seats in England, in the United Kingdom, despite winning only 48% of the vote or something. And you may ask why. Actually, it was less than that, but significantly less than that. But you may ask why. And the answer is that there's 50 states in the United States, and each of them votes for a presidential candidate. Then all of those states are each given a certain number of votes in this thing called the Electoral College, which is basically saying that, the interests of all the states must be represented rather than the interests of all the people. Because the United States is a collection of states rather than just a collection of people. Now, that's basically the argument. I don't necessarily agree with it, but that's how it's constructed, and those are the rules. So each state gets a number of votes in accordance with however many people there are in that state. So California has 54 votes. Maine has 4. And that's because Maine has very few people and California has 40 million. So once that's done, there's 538 total votes distributed across all of the states. A candidate needs 270 to win. A candidate must win enough electoral votes across all of the states where they can get 270 votes. And that's the entire game. Whoever gets 270 wins the election. If no candidate gets 270, it gets thrown to the House of Representatives, which is basically our parliament. But for the purposes of this, you can kind of assume that a candidate will almost certainly get 270. We haven't had a tie since 140 years ago.
Okay. So just to summarize, so there's the system called the Electoral College. Each state gets votes essentially proportional to the state's population, right? And then at the end of the day, those votes are tallied up, right? And the winner becomes president, right?
That's correct.
You already alluded to it a little bit. The Electoral College can lead to quite curious situations, right? So for example, in 2016, Clinton had more votes than Trump, but she still lost the election. Can you explain a little bit more, like how this can happen?
Yeah, so basically Hillary Clinton got more votes than Trump. In fact, she won by 2% more, 48 to 46. But the problem was Hillary Clinton did not get more votes in enough states to get to 270, whereas Donald Trump did. So Hillary Clinton got a lot of votes in states like California, in states like New York. These are states that vote for the Democratic candidate by millions of votes. But the thing for the Electoral College is that it doesn't matter if you win a state by 1 vote or by 1 million, you still get all of its votes, with a couple of tiny exceptions that we don't need to get into right now. And so, Hillary won California by millions of votes, but the problem was that didn't really matter. She just needed to win it by 2 or 3. Now, it doesn't mean it's a bad thing to win California by millions of votes, but it just doesn't mean anything. You have to win Wisconsin, Pennsylvania also. She didn't win any of the core, she didn't win enough of the other states. She basically had hyper localized strength in a few areas. So she ran up the score there, but then did not actually get enough votes in the rest of the country. And that's why Hillary Clinton didn't get elected president and Donald Trump did.
So some states are dominated by one of the two main parties, the Democrats or the Republicans. But the more interesting states, the so-called swing states, used that phrase a little bit earlier as well, are those that can be reasonably won by either of the two main candidates. Can you, again, because it's just so important, right, to understand the election, can you detail the pivotal role of these states for us?
Yeah, of course. So as it stands, the way that the parties have their bases of power, this is not by design, this is just the way that it works out right now, is that the Democrats have they're roughly guaranteed to get about 220 electoral votes, so to say. They have enough strength, enough states to get basically guaranteed that they'll get at least 220 electoral votes, or 205 at least. Republicans also have a guarantee of getting at least that many. So the remaining 100 or so electoral votes, and I'm just using rough numbers here, the remaining 100 or so electoral votes really come down to a collection of states that are very, very close, and they can go, and they have gone for either candidate depending on the year. One of them, for example, is Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was decided by less than 1% in 2016. Then Biden won it by just over 1% in 2020. There was Wisconsin, which was decided by less than 1% in both 2016 and 2020. And then there's Michigan, which was decided by just 0.25% in 2016, and then Trump won it by Biden won it by 3% in 2020. So those three states really give about 44 electoral votes between them. And that's a lot. So if you think about it, if Democrats have like a base of roughly about, if we're getting exact, Democrats have about 226 votes that they generally get, right? And so where you get to is, if you have 226 votes already given to you and you get those 44, you get to 270. So this is why Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania is so critical for the Democrats, because if you win those 44 electoral votes, if you win those states, you become the next president. And if you don't win those states, then you have to try to win other states. You have to try to win Georgia. You have to try to win Arizona. You have to try to win Nevada. And I'm not saying that they can't do that, but it becomes harder, right? Because if you don't win one of these states, you have to win something else.
Right. So I assume that this also means that the candidates focus their campaigns sharply on those swing states. I assume they wouldn't come to California that often because the Democrats will win it anyway, kind of. I assume they will be in Pennsylvania like half of the time, right?
Yeah, this is exactly what you see. Like, Democrats spent so much time in Pennsylvania that they might as well just set up like permanent headquarters there.
All right. Let's talk a bit more about data and how to use data. Maybe first, what kind of data do you rely on in your projects at Split Ticket?
Yeah, so most of what we rely on is elections data. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of data in tabular CSV formats and whatnot that we just take. We try to feature engineer it to extract more insights out of it. For example, you can have the Democratic vote share, the white share, and the black share, of populations. And you may start by saying like, well, what am I going to do with just that? Well, several things. You can actually predict, what's the percentage of votes that Democrats get based on, like what's the percentage of white votes that Democrats get in any given state. And you can do that because for example, that wherever they are, usually Black voters give Democrats about 90% of the vote, 90 to 95. And so you can be like, well, if I know that, I can just simply do an algebraic equation and figure out what percent of the white vote did they win in these states. I can do some sort of ratio to calculate the polarization in a place, right? Like how different are the white and the Black votes in a given area. So in the deep South, in Mississippi, Louisiana, places that had civil rights issues, we'll see that the whites almost all vote Republican and the Black voters almost all vote Democratic. So this is the type of thing that we try to analyze, and the data is not clean. So one of the biggest challenges that we face is in figuring out how to clean and impute missing data, especially because those types of decisions meaningfully change the model outputs that you get. So, we work with a lot of tabular data, but ultimately, and it's not very big in terms of, volume. We're dealing with maybe 3,000 rows if we're lucky, which is nothing in the scale of data science and machine learning. Like usually you have hundreds of thousands or even millions of data points, not here. So you can't use standard AI techniques to do a lot of elections inference.
Are you also using polls, like more kind of current data?
Yeah, we use polls. We use a lot of polls. We do our own polls. We also check the polls from other sources, and we follow that path in which we think like, okay, let's try to do an unbiased aggregation of the polls, an unbiased average of election polls, and apply it to each state. And then we take each state's average of polls, and we also take that, and then we say, okay, well, now that we have both the national polls applied at a statewide level and then the state polls, who's ahead in both of those cases, and how does that, kind of give us odds of an election victory? Because if you think about it, what is a poll? It's kind of a way of modeling election. It just depends on semantics. You are really surveying thousands of voters, and then you were assembling an inference of, or an estimate of how elections work. So if you average all of those models, you're kind of doing a prediction. You're kind of doing like an experts poll, so to say, right? Like a poll of experts. That's kind of what we do here.
Oh, that's an excellent view on this. So you see a poll as a prediction by itself. Right? And for me, this begs the question of how accurate is that prediction, right? AKA the poll, right?
Yeah. So, you and I both have backgrounds in ML, so we both know that if your underlying model isn't very good, polling experts isn't going to get you anywhere. Right? Like, for example, if you're doing decision trees, right, and you have like 1,000 and you have like 1,000 estimators, but your depth is only 2, you're probably going to underfit a lot. And you may not actually get a very good result. Sometimes you just need to dial that depth up a bit. So similarly here, you have to kind of make the rules are a little bit more flexible because there's no strict standard. You have to make your own inferences and your own understanding and your own rules. In our case, what we do is if we don't have confidence that the pollster is doing if the pollster isn't being honest with data, if the pollster isn't following best practices, if the pollster could be realistically suspected of fabricating their data, then we don't include them because that meaningfully changes what we're doing. So we try to make sure that we include only the highest quality data based on how we understand data collection practices to be among these pollsters and how we understand their weighting and practices to be. For example, we don't use Insider Advantage, which is a polling firm in the South. And the reason we don't do that is because I've looked at their methodology, and they can upweight certain respondents by 15 or 20 times. So if you
Oh,
have one black Trump voter, they're going to say, oh, that counts for 20 times the,
mm,
the amount that like a regular, like that a white Democratic or white Republican voter would. And that's preposterous. That type of extrapolation cannot be done, but that's what they do. And so we're like, okay, we're not going to take that.
Interesting. I mean, there can be issues kind of on the end of the pollster, like the ones that make the polls. But I imagine there also can be problems on the potential voters, right? So some people suggest in 2016, when Trump was elected for president, polls were misleading because a significant number of people might not have admitted that they're tending to vote for Trump. And actually, we had similar things in Germany happening too, that the right populist party, they were surprisingly strong in the elections, and people suggested that it's because the voters wouldn't admit to, I mean, their choice, essentially, right?
Yeah. This is tough, right? Like you get into the issue of, first of all, are people who are responding to polls being honest about it? And to that, I always say, like, you just have to assume they are. I mean,
Yeah.
otherwise you get into all types of voodoo statistics and science. And at that point, what are you even doing, right? Like at that, if you can't trust the basic core component of polling, of modeling, then you just shouldn't be doing it. For me, I've always been like, no, we're just going to trust that respondents are telling the truth. And the truth is, we don't see any evidence to suggest respondents are lying. Now, what is also true, though, is that voters can get influenced by polls. This is true. Voters can, so for example, we have, there's a common school of thought, which I think has some merit, that in 2016, a lot of voters believed Hillary Clinton was going to win. And a lot of officials believed that. So they took actions consistent with a Hillary Clinton win. For example, some voters said, well, Clinton's going to win. I'm going to vote for Republicans down ballot. As a result, Republicans actually won the Senate, and they all ran ahead of Trump in the Senate. And
Okay.
the result of this is that Trump entered office with a trifecta. Now, would that have happened regardless? I don't know. But in 2020, when everyone thought a Biden win was basically guaranteed, a lot of voters down ballot also chose to back Republicans. They said, well, Biden's going to win in a landslide. I think we should have a check on the government, so maybe we should go for a Republican down ballot. Then Biden barely won. As a result of that, well, Biden entered office with a substantially higher amount of Republicans in office than you would have otherwise expected. So this is kind of why you end up in these situations where sometimes voters behave differently from what you expect because they're reacting to information that they have in their head. That information may not be accurate, but what are they being informed by? They're being informed by coverage. They're being informed by polls. And so data scientists have a real responsibility to get this stuff right because it impacts how people act.
So let's finally talk about potential personal biases, right? The US seems very much polarized. Depending on what TV channel you watch or what newspaper you read, you get very different political analysis, right? And so at Split Ticket, how do you guys try to prevent that your own partisan views influence your work?
So in Split Ticket, what we try to do is we try to just read a whole lot of different news sources to make sure that we get full coverage of everything, so that in case there's relevant campaign news that leaks in one side but doesn't in the other, we're well informed. But the truth is, news only helps us so much. Most of our forecasts are just purely data based. They're not, we don't like to, we can explain them with what we see on the news, and we try to read a variety of news to see different partisan perspectives, because explaining the results is almost as important as what the results are. In fact, maybe more. But when it comes to actually, figuring out what the results are and like how to conduct your surveys, how to create your models, that we try not to get biased by either side's news on.
But you mentioned it, so data can be a way to hedge yourselves from personal biases. So if used correctly.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Mhm. All right, thank you, Lakshya, for this very interesting discussion. Thank you, Joan Eintor and Christian Kreitzmann, for all the work in the background. And thanks to you for listening to this podcast.